Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Voice of Authority webinar brought to you today by Skyroom and the Key Worker Homes Fund. My name is Toby Fox. I'm the Managing Director of 3Fox, the marketing agency for councils. As regular viewers will know, our job is to keep our network of councils and developers and investors and their influencers and advisors connected. And we used to do that and love doing it at physical events. And it looks like we'll be doing that again soon, fingers crossed. But since lockdown 1 began, we've been working through this online channel, the Voice of Authority. It's a platform for councils to discuss their ambitions, their challenges, their influences, and issues of urgency. As we make our way towards the end of lockdown 3, we're as determined as ever to keep the conversation going and keep our network communicating. And to that end, we're going to be back next Tuesday at 11 a.m. with Morgan Sindel and an expert panel to ask how healthcare estate transformation is being funded. That's a look at the Naylor Review 3 years on. You can register to watch that at thevoiceofauthority.co.uk. But back to today and the Key Worker Homes Fund, a £100 million resource set up by the developer Skyroom for London's local authorities and housing associations to provide pro bono technical consultancy to all eligible applicants and development financing to successful bidders for projects ranging in scale from a dozen to several hundred homes. The first stage of applications close at midday this Friday, the 16th of April. The expression of interest form takes about 5 minutes to complete, and you can find a link to that in the chat now or very shortly. The issue that Skyroom has asked us to focus on today is around the challenges of health inequality and fuel poverty and climate crisis and the need for leadership. The suggestion is that we need the same impetus now that brought the public and private sectors together to establish the NHS in the 1940s, to achieve the moon landings in the 1960s. And this is about a recovered sense of public purpose, a mission economy. And that's the key to tackling current and future problems, according to Mariana Mazzucato, who was described by Wired as one of the most influential economists in the world. What might we achieve with a mission-led approach to housing? What small-scale interventions can we make to reap widespread positive impact for our citizens? Could strong public-private partnerships encourage a level of boldness and experimentation to be applied to the biggest problems, as Mazzucato would have it? To answer these questions, we've got a terrific panel lined up, and it's a great pleasure to welcome to this post-Easter Purdah special edition of the Voice of Authority, in alphabetical order, Yolanda Barnes, who is chair of the Bartlett Real Estate Institute, Sir Steve Bullock DL, chairman of the Housing and Finance Institute, and Olivia Harris, who's chief exec of Dolphin Living, and Arthur Kay, who is chair of the Key Worker Homes Fund and CEO of Skyroom. Now, I'm really lucky because I get to spend the next hour quizzing these brilliant minds, and you viewers can join in. You can use the Q&A to fire in questions to fuel our discussion, but do bear in mind that we'll gravitate to the shortest questions first, and by all means use the chat to share your perhaps more expansive thoughts with other viewers. We've got a few surveys and polls for you as well, so you can contribute by responding to those when they pop up on your screens. So let's get the conversation going. Our focus today is on mission. So Olivia, could you set out for us what mission you're on and why you're on that mission?
Yeah, thank you, Toby. I should just explain a bit about Dolphin Living. We're an affordable housing charity whose mission is to provide homes at a discount to market rent to London's workers on modest incomes. So we develop our own homes as well as buying those built by other developers, and we buy existing homes. We own 800 homes and have a strategy to deliver a further 200 homes over the next 3 years. We focus on homes to rent to critical or key workers, because many of those workers haven't had the opportunity to amass the deposit necessary to either buy it outright or through shared ownership. We also recognise that some of our tenants choose to rent as it gives them flexibility, for example, in the early stages of their career, whilst others may never be able to buy, so are long-term renters. What's important is that our residents choose to live in inner London to be near their place of work. And you asked why as well. So some statistics here. The median rent for a one-bedroom dwelling is greater than the median earner can afford in every inner London borough. So median earners either live in housing they cannot afford, or that does not meet their housing need, or have long commutes, which can be expensive and particularly difficult for those working unsociable hours. And of the locations we operate in, I give Westminster as an example, 25% of homes in Westminster are social housing, 74% are private housing, and only 1% are the intermediate housing, including homes at below market rent, and so affordable to median earners. And without more homes at affordable rent, Westminster and surrounding boroughs will not be able to attract and retain the key and now defined as critical workers that the residents' economy and workers depend upon.
How does that translate into a sense of mission, Olivia? Can you kind of paint a picture for us about what that mission is for Dolphin?
Yeah, so our charitable objects say that we're here to provide homes to those that need to be near their place of work, but can't afford to do so. And so that's why we're looking at expanding our portfolio. It's also why I spend my time on webinars such as these, promoting this need, because I sometimes feel I'm really pleased that there are lots of others saying the same, who will be saying similar things. We need key workers, we rely on key workers. The pandemic has shown how much we rely on key workers. And early news coverage at the beginning of the pandemic showed, the conditions of people travelling to work to support us all, and yet their travelling to work was unsafe. So we are always here promoting and also delivering this mission of providing homes to key workers and highlighting the importance of key workers in inner London.
And I guess there's almost a practical sense in which that affects the sorts of sites you choose, the sorts of projects you want to get involved in. But is there a sort of mission-led influence as well on the work that you want to do and the places you want to operate?
Yeah, so we look for, in terms of places, we look for locations that provide a 30-minute commute to Westminster. And that we're a charity where our original funding came from Westminster. And when we're delivering our own developments, we aim to deliver at least 50% affordable housing in those developments, with rents at an average of 2/3 of market rent, as well as buying affordable housing from other developers. So at the moment, 79% of our portfolio is affordable housing at an average discount of 40% to the local market rent. And it's that level of discount that is required to make homes in inner London affordable to the median earner. As well as you've already alluded to, considering livability in our designs and making sure that our homes are high quality. Just because people don't earn the greatest amount of money doesn't mean they shouldn't be able to live in the middle of the best city in the world in a home that meets their needs and is of suitably high quality.
And does this mean that you're only looking at sites within 30 minutes of Westminster, or are you starting to think beyond Westminster? Does your mission allow you to think beyond Westminster?
Yeah, so we think beyond Westminster, but we're really focused on zones 1, 2 or 3 where there are particularly good travel links, because we are focused on people that need to be in inner London to work. And actually, the last year has changed that quite a lot with the increased working from home that so many people have been able to undertake in the last year. But there has still been, a significant number of people that do need to travel into or be in inner London in order to be able to carry out their job effectively. And a lot of those are for traditional key workers such as teachers or nurses, but there's also sort of a growing sort of number of key workers, many of whom we might not have traditionally thought of as key workers, whether that's delivery drivers or people supporting the infrastructure of the city, those working in transport, for example.
Thanks, Olivia. So, Yolanda, feel free to comment on. I'll pick up on anything that Olivia's said. But I wonder if you've got a sort of planetary scale knowledge of the housing market and what the industry is doing. Is this an increasing trend? Is this sense of mission increasing? And the other aspect of this is it doesn't apply just to Westminster, right?
These are issues that apply to virtually every world city and a lot of smaller cities that I've studied. So, this is, I think a lot of the challenge is actually getting the mission right. And I think, and this again is a global issue, that the mission. At the Institute, I state I have a personal mission, that everybody lives in a home they love at a price they can afford, which sounds very straightforward, the same as sort of landing on the moon or, providing healthcare free at the point of delivery. Very simple to say, but inside of that is a a huge range of complexity and issue. And I think one of the chief ones is that when we talk about homes, we've been talking far too much in London, in this country, and indeed in other real estate markets about housing units. I think and sometimes when talking about housing, we've been just concentrating on social or affordable housing and not thinking about it in the context of all homes. Now, the most important thing, and I think Arthur very kindly sort of billed me on social media as a champion of sustainable urbanism, we have got to think about homes in the broader context, in the context of place. We don't live in housing units, we live in places. And our home is as much about what happens when we step outside the front door as it is what happens inside four walls. And I think that if we don't consider places and the sort of places that we're making and creating and providing, and how affordable those places are to be in, then we're actually missing the mission, the real mission. So I think the real estate world and the world of housing and built environment is filled with people who think they know what the mission is. But unless and until they're all talking and communicating with each other and getting out of their specialist silos, I think we're not going to have the correct mission. And what's so great about today is actually getting some of the people who conventionally have sort of worked in very specialist areas, whether it be in local government or development or housing provision, to start this conversation. And I think it's really important that we all get clear on what that mission is.
Thanks, Yolanda. So Steve, do you want to give us a little bit of background on what the Institute does and perhaps play into that, pick up on that conversation around how mission is influencing the development of the housing industry at the moment?
Absolutely. The Housing and Finance Institute exists to help local authorities understand how they can effectively deliver housing, and Yolanda's absolutely right, better places. And it grew out of a report that was done by Natalie Elphick and Keith House in 2014-15, which flagged up some real problems, and particularly from the local authority end, but also more widely. We've been struggling a little bit through COVID because, like yourselves, we rely on talking to people and actually networking and getting them face to face. But we're finding ways around that, because the local authority role is really significant. It isn't just about building homes. In some cases, it's not about building homes directly at all, but in their different aspects of what local authorities do, they have a huge influence. And we've been trying to spread good practice and ideas, and crucially, encourage the building of public-private partnerships. The mission thing, I think, is really interesting. And when I was preparing for this, I couldn't help kind of casting my mind back long before the moon landings, but to the end of the Second World War. And not because I'm old enough to have been around then, but what happened in the years after the war was there was an extraordinary appetite to address the issues that the country faced at the end of the war, not the least of which was the devastation of housing around the country, and a need for much more housing. Something like 3 million homes were needed at that time. And as somebody who grew up in one of those homes that a council built, for me, the mission has always been about choice, giving people who need a home. And I one of the things that HFI talks about is homes, not just units of housing, but a place where a family can grow, where they can build a life, their kids can go to school, work, and so on. And so many of the problems we face at the moment are that the places that people have to live don't give them the scope to do that. So I think the organisations that I'm involved with have tended to be ones that were addressing that issue. So I guess it kind of became a bit of a personal mission for me.
I'm going to come back to that, Steve, on the personal nature of this. But it seems to me that what the three of you have said so far is really this is about humanising the provision of residential of houses, of units, turning those into homes. That seems to be a recurrent theme here. Arthur, what's your mission? What's Skyrim's mission?
Thanks, Toby. So Skyrim's mission is to work with key workers to improve their quality of life. And our specific approach to doing that actually really chimes with what Olivia was referring to at their mission at Dolphin Living. So it's trying to provide affordable, beautiful and sustainable homes near to where they work. And we hear a lot about the ideas of the compact city or the 15-minute city, and it's trying to make that a tangible reality for key workers. And I think we've all heard in the past and throughout the pandemic about the challenges of affordability and also long commutes suffered by key workers, and we don't need to readdress them here. But it's around finding technical solutions and funding solutions to be able to make that a reality. And so the mission of the Key Worker Homes Fund is actually exactly the same as Skyrim. It's looking to bring some financial firepower to that mission. In June last year, the G15 housing associations came together to launch the Homes for Heroes report, which is an amazing piece of work, which I'm sure many on the call are familiar with. And one of the big calls for action there was for the G15 to work together, for government to bring policies forward to support key worker housing, and also for finance to step in to be able to accelerate the delivery of key worker housing. And so we actually launched the Key Worker Homes Fund in direct response to this, saying that if capital is an issue in part of this, and there are multiple issues that mean that this is a challenging thing, and as I'm sure we're going to come on to later, but if capital is a part of it, we wanted to bring, in the scheme of things, a relatively small amount of money, £100 million, but in the size of the problem is obviously much larger than that, but £100 million to bring to bear to be able to accelerate the delivery of these affordable homes. And particularly, it's around those early stages. Again, people on the call who are familiar with how local authority or housing association finance works. It's often the early stages of a project which sometimes needs that financing, which is more at risk. It's often more technically complex, or there's not yet the development finance available to go and actually build it. And so to be able to really inject that capital at the very early stage where it's still at risk, to be able to bring forward those key worker homes. And so what we're really kind of looking to do at Skyrim is to work in partnership, in public-private partnership with local authorities and housing associations, who are the biggest landowners in London. So, as Yolanda's work has shown in the past, London boroughs typically own between 25 and 30% of the borough in which they operate. The G15 Housing Association own over 600,000 homes in the capital, housing 1 in 10 Londoners. So these are enormous landowners. And I think increasingly people are recognising that the local authorities have an enormous role to play in delivering housing, but it's around how they can work also in addition with the private sector to accelerate that delivery. And that's really what we're excited about doing.
Does it, thanks, Arthur. Yolanda, does it matter whether this is a personal mission or an institutional mission? There seems to me to be an influence in people's attitudes towards work is changing, and their identification with the place they work and the mission of the institution they work for, the organisation they work for, seems to be changing. Has that influenced this idea of missions for companies? And does it matter? Does it matter whether people are personally engaged or whether it's just an organisational engagement?
Oh gosh, that is such a big question. But inside of the built environment, this sort of mission-orientated way or direction of companies is actually a relatively new thing. I think where it is adopted, either formally or informally in the form of a mission statement, what strikes me is, of course, the mission comes out of the personal. In the end, companies, any organization, is a collection of people. And I think what's interesting is when you do put the focus on people, whether it's inside a community or inside an organization, that at the heart of things, what matters to people about their places is remarkably similar. And I think probably, the word popularity is quite scorned, I think, in sort of architectural and design circles. And actually, I think we have to rehabilitate the word popular, because what is popular in housing and the built environment is remarkably similar. Even across cultures and continents. And I think we need to reconnect with what it means to create a kind of habitat for human beings, as it were. And I think the formalization, the organization of the industry, in its broadest sense, has taken us away from what it is to co-create a human habitat together. That's what cities are and have been across continents and through millennia. So I think, we should trust both the personal and the organizational missions and make sure that we're finding ways of capturing what will be personal to most of us in our organisation, back to sort of getting straight about what gets in the way of people creating places for themselves, as we have done through our human history, and what is actually preventing that working. So it links into one of the questions in the way that we should be creating, and we need housing for everybody who's in the city. So you could say, well, everybody in the city is a key worker. And if we start from that basis, that cities are collections of people, and we need to house ourselves, and think of it from that point of view, rather than this very sort of formalized sort of all these 6 sets of distinctions about who manages, who controls land, qualifies, and who doesn't qualify. I think we have to go towards a much more inclusive sort of mission, which of course involves organisations, but at the heart is people.
Thanks a lot, Yolanda. We were struggling with some audio problems with your connection. It's sort of in and out, but we got the gist of what you're saying there. Olivia, I know you want to comment on what Yolanda was saying, but also if you could pick up on, there's a question in from one of our viewers, Maddock Backcup, who is asking what happens when people change their job. And this is a very sort of practical question, but what if someone becomes not a key worker anymore? Does that mean that they can no longer live in a Dolphin residence? How far does the mission kind of start restricting what you can offer and become an inhibitor rather than a provider?
So personally to Dolphin, we have a very broad definition of people that qualify to live in our homes. So we're not restricted to traditional key workers. And the point that I wanted to pick up on that question, actually, I was looking at, but it also picks up on what Yolanda said, which is about, if people need to live in central London to do their work, they are by definition, by our definition, Dolphin's definition, they are key workers. And we've done quite a lot of work as a charity trying to promote this expansion of this definition of key workers to include the critical workers that the government's listed during the pandemic. So no, people don't have to leave their homes because they cease to work as what is a traditional key worker, because we have a broader definition. If they didn't need, we have 3-year tenancies, and there's always a presumption of renewal. The only reason that we've asked people to move on is because their income has been greater than 90,000, their household incomes is greater than 90,000, or that they can afford housing in the local area from their earnings, because their earnings have increased during their tenancy. We wouldn't ask people to move on because they change job. And like I said, we work with a much broader definition of key worker than the traditional definition.
Fantastic. Thanks, Olivia. Okay, so Steve, we've got lots of threads running now. We've got this sense of personal and organizational mission. We've got the challenge of getting that mission right, and how important that is to achieving your targets. We've got this idea of co-creating places and homes that are popular, that people want to live in. Do you want to pick up on any of those, and perhaps also talk a little bit about where the sense of mission might inhibit what you're able to deliver rather than fuel or empower it?
I think one of the things that was coming to my mind listening to the conversation is that there's an issue about empowering either local organisations, local residents, to get on and make some of these things happen. And there's a real tension between top down, we need to build 300,000 new homes a year, and how you actually deliver that, because the delivery will be very different place by place. And one of the risks is that even a mission-driven organisation can descend on a place and try to do something in a way which doesn't make sense for that locality. And I think that's one of the things that local authorities, you would hope, are good at. It's something that housing associations are good at. The history of housing associations is fascinating. There have been waves of growth of housing associations. They, in particular, at the end of the last but one century, it was around addressing slum conditions, and some of the ones which are still around were set up then. But we then had that wave in the 60s. And some of those have become very big organizations which are able to do things in different ways. And it's interesting to talk to some of their leading figures, chairs and chief executives. The ones that are successful are the ones that haven't lost sight of what their original mission was. They may now be building homes for sale, they'll be multi-million, billion-pound organizations, but hanging on to that mission has been really important. Sometimes it goes a little bit wrong, and I suspect that's when they lose track of the mission. But the ones that are doing well, the mission still is what drives them.
Is there any way, do you think, we can tie this in, Steve, to the concept of building back better? You know, does that idea play into this idea that we've got a mission to provide these houses?
Absolutely. The post-war boom was great, but look at all the things that then went wrong. And somehow that we need to try and do some learning so that we build at pace in lots of different ways, lots of different tenures, but we try not to make some of the mistakes that were made in the past. And that doesn't mean you can't build high, but trying to do the learning. We're doing this against a very, very difficult background. I mean, we shouldn't lose sight of just how problematic some of the issues that local authorities, housing associations, other housing providers are dealing with at the moment. It goes back to the top and the bottom. We need a national understanding that we have to make this work better, but we also need to give organisations the space to do it at a local level in a way that will make sense.
Great, thanks, Steve. Arthur, what about this sense of getting the mission right then? How are you making sure that the houses that you're building, the work that you're doing, isn't repeating mistakes of the past, and that you're learning from the past and making sure that this mission is the right mission and providing the right solutions to the right problems?
Great question. I'm not sure we can know that entirely, but specifically we do the combination of, I think which a lot of organisations do, of talking to our prospective users, so talking to key workers and understanding their challenges. An example of that we've shared in the past is a midwife in Hackney who's one of the first ambassadors of the Key Worker Homes Fund, who has to commute around an hour and a half each way and grew up in Hackney but can't actually afford to live there. So talking to people like that and really trying to understand the challenges that they face on a day-to-day basis. And then also looking at kind of the overarching data sets in terms of the challenges that key workers face. So at the moment, according to a report at the back end of last year, over 50% of London's teachers can't afford to live in the capital, and it's in recent history the highest rate of teachers leaving the profession, for example. And so it's I guess anecdotal evidence plus and personal evidence plus overarching data sets. And in terms of how, again, we try and do it is it's working closely with some of our partners. So we work with local authorities and housing associations and trying to understand what some of their challenges are in terms of delivery. Because I think almost every housing association and local authority we talk to has an ambition to deliver more homes. It's understanding what are the things that are getting in the way of that delivery. And so our role, if we kind of zoom out, if we think of this as an ecosystem, and the analogy we often use is kind of if we're in a David Attenborough documentary and we're looking at under the sea, we see ourselves at Skyrim as kind of the little feeder fish that kind of cleans the enormous whale that's going along and just makes sure there's everything under control there. So we're in our niche ecosystem. We're a very, very small player who's working to support this much larger mission and how we can play a role in that. So what we look to do is to understand a local authority's existing pipeline and existing infrastructure and portfolio of properties, or the same with a housing association, and say, what can we, very small organisation, do to help accelerate that delivery? And so we bring to bear our financing, so the £100 million Key Worker Homes Fund. We bring to bear our technical expertise. So we've developed a range of different technologies, a podium system, geospatial mapping technology, and a specialism in airspace development using modern methods of construction. And then we bring together simply the bandwidth of a small focused team who can work with, hand in glove with a development team to accelerate delivery of different projects. And so the partners we're working with at the moment are local authorities and housing associations who we're working with them on their land to accelerate that delivery, rather than, I think, typically one of the questions in the chat alluded to this, but what's been the barriers historically in terms of why public and private have not managed to work well together? And I'd be really interested to hear what Yolanda, Steve and Olivia have to say about this too. But from the research we've done, it's often a lack of trust and a feeling that these are competing priorities. It's a binary thing. Either I own this land or you own this land. Either it's delivered for private or it's delivered for affordable. And as long as those priorities are seen as at loggerheads with one another, there's never going to be, as we see it, that opportunity to unlock value for people, planet, and profits. And so it's that trust. If we get that right up front and make sure and that's why I think mission is an exciting thing to be working on, because it's around getting that alignment to make sure everyone's pointing in the same direction. And if you can get that piece right, you can then unlock a lot of value. But as long as you're fighting over a binary, who owns this land or who's going to make this pound or that pound, it's always going to be a loggerheads.
Yeah, Yolanda, straight to you with that one. And I guess whenever we're talking about public-private partnerships, it always comes down to that issue of trust, and fundamentally underneath that is the issue of money quite often. How far does mission go, a sense of mission go to resolving the conflicts that come out of a lack of trust or a difficulty in creating that trust?
Well, I think if we're clear on what the mission is, we start to see that the solutions have to be multidisciplinary, that no single agency, public, private, third sector or whatever, can possibly begin to solve the issues by themselves. I think it means that we have to let go of some of the old sort of totems of the past, and very consciously, that's everybody letting go of some of the ways that we've been operating. I mean, the Q&A is sort of full of, as it were, these section siloed sort of definitions of key workers, or these sort of highly specialized areas that we created in the 20th century for an age that actually no longer exists, where the challenges now are different. So I think one of the things we could do, which I think would have an impact on the area of finance and trust, is actually think about new forms of tenure, new ways of sharing resources, which is radical, but is an area that I think has been not so closely looked at. So, simply creating vehicles whereby the public sector and the private sector can co-own land, for example. Land pooling agreements could be a very important sort of element in this, where all parties, as it were, are in it together, and which ideally would also involve perhaps local people, you know, community land trusts plus, as it were, might be part of the solution. Unless we're prepared to really tackle this as if it was a moonshot mission, which means, you know, inventing new things, you know, creating the new digital environments, for example, that might be required to help facilitate this. Tokenization, use of blockchain, there's a whole list of things, but unless it does involve everybody from sort of ecologists to economists and you know, everyone in between, we're not going to get there. So I come back to sort of actually articulating the size and scope and importance of the mission, I think it has to be the starting point, and relating that to a wide variety of actors, sort of personal stances, and embracing all of them has to be a key starting point. So I think mission's very important in getting to the sort of multidisciplinary solutions that are going to be needed.
Stuff. Thanks, Yolandi. I'm just about to launch another poll asking our viewers about how far housing providers should be actually planning to meet the needs of key workers. And while viewers focus on that, Olivia, we're talking about the sort of public and private sector working together now, and how mission enables that. I'd be really interested in your views on that, and also perhaps unpack this idea of land pooling. I mean, how might that work or not work for Dolphin?
So I wonder if it'd just be helpful here to share an example of a partnership between Dolphin Living and Westminster City Council. Sure. So Westminster City Council owned a piece of land which comprised a rundown community centre and a sports club that were no longer fit for purpose. And they also had an aspiration to deliver increased quantities of affordable housing, particularly the sub-market rented housing that we wanted to deliver. So we had, as Yolanda was talking about, we had those aligned objectives or an aligned mission. And actually they capped our financial return, which we were happy to accept because we're a charity, so that essentially we had to deliver the maximum amount of affordable housing. So what we did was we took the site, we re-delivered the community centre alongside a ground rent, which enables them to, you know, maintain and manage the community centre for the long term, and provided 73 homes, 2/3 of which are affordable rents. So whilst capping our financial return. So it was very much about finding the things that we could be aligned on in our mission and allowing us to deliver that together to you know, to the outcomes that everybody wanted. And the point about land price is really interesting. I think, Yolanda, you mentioned earlier that local authorities often own 25% of the land in their local area, and more is owned by other public bodies. One of the issues has been, and I know there's been quite a lot of talk about this, is value for money that public bodies have to achieve when using that land, and that value for money has always been assessed in terms of pounds. And actually, I think we need to move to a new way of assessing value for money, and what does it deliver for the local community, what does it deliver for the local authority, because value is not just about pounds. It's, you know, and one of the big things it's about is securing housing for key workers for the longer term. I'm sorry, I think I've probably gone off and not quite answered your question, but though hopefully that's given some food. I can see Yolanda's also got her hand up.
It's brilliant because it's opened up a whole Pandora's box of conversation here. Yolanda, do you want to come back straight away, and then we'll move on to Stephen and Arthur.
Well, I think to try and sort of tackle both this sort of specific issue of plots of land. Yes, there is a huge problem if the Public Accounts Committee sort of scrutinise on the basis of maximum number of pounds achieved at day one. But of course, the word value has a much bigger implication than that. And I think what we haven't, because it's very difficult to do under the sort of 20th century sort of methods and modes that we've been operating under, it's very difficult to, as it were, endow a local authority. So land is capable of creating long-term income streams. To my mind, that is the true value of land. And increasingly, I think land's being thought of in that sort of way. Now, if local authorities actually start, and the Public Accounts Committee start sort of accepting that the capability of land to endow a local authority over the long term in terms of income is actually higher value, which it should be than the sort of the immediate short-term value, then actually all we need is a different way of sort of considering what is value, best value. And we need a sort of mindset that's 21st century rather than 20th century, and sort of accepting that value is about sort of savings made on health and social well-being and all that sort of thing over the long term, as well as income receipts. We can start conceptualizing a value in that way, then I think that would open the door to, if we really are serious about creating 20-minute cities, then why don't we just sort of think of land in terms of, let's provide whatever housing, whatever, not just housing, or thinking of housing as all the goods and services that we generate demand for over the course of our lifetimes. True mixed communities, workplaces, local workspaces, which after COVID, we're realizing that we need. And as well as the work from home sort of communities, we start thinking about pieces of land as actually serving and servicing and enabling the thriving, the long-term sort of measured over decades sort of thriving of place. Then we can start reconceptualizing what we mean by value, and consequently then how we finance that.
Well, it's fascinating, isn't it? Because I'm a shareholder of a property developer. I'm saying, well, no, the value of that land is in pounds, and it's mine partly. So that idea of how mission
and your return on capital employed is what you're demanding, and
exactly. But then that's perhaps where the idea of mission comes in, because mission will determine what the views of everybody involved in an organisation are as to what that organisation is trying to produce. Arthur, I know you want to come in on this, but first I really want to hear what Sir Steve's got to say when he gets his teeth into this idea of value, and also perhaps how blue sky can you think as a local authority around ownership of land and how we value it?
I think this is absolutely key, and the points that have been made are really important. We have to get a completely different mindset. One of the projects that I'm working on at the moment is about those parcels of land which are locked up and are just sitting there doing nothing because the owner has got an idea they will do something with it at a future date. Now, in some cases, that's just sitting there, letting it increase in value. In other cases, because they want to build a bridge or whatever it is. But all over London, there are pieces of land that nothing is happening, and you can't do a permanent development on. And the particular project, we're looking at whether you can use them in the meantime for housing, probably temporary housing, and there's 250,000 people in London living in temporary housing, but good quality. So the mission is about actually good quality housing, making use of sites that aren't currently being used in any productive way. Now that's not going to solve the big problem. It's a niche part of it, but we need to think about things like that. And it's one of the great things about Skyroom actually is kind of, well, how can you squeeze more out of a piece of land? And I really think that there are people out there who've had interesting conversations about how you value land for decades, and they've been kind of off in the undergrowth. And maybe this is the time that we actually start to say, no, let's have that big national debate, because if this is what's stopping us solving the problems, perhaps we can have a go at it.
Thanks, Sir Steve. Arthur, you want to pick up on something, so obviously feel free to do that. But I'd also like to open an angle on what Sir Steve just said. I read a piece by, I think it was Pete Gladwell at Legal & General on LinkedIn a while ago. And his point was that the moment you put a pound sign next to the value of what you're delivering, then you lose sight of the outputs that aren't financial. So if we're talking about delivering social value, that was Pete's point. So if you're delivering some sort of social value, the moment you start to put a pound sign next to that, you lose sight of what the actual thing is that you're delivering. So there's how much of a problem is it to you as a developer to have to try and put a metric next to the value of what you're delivering when you're looking at your mission to deliver key worker homes?
So we seem to be quite good in many, I mean, people use money as a measure of value because it's easy to count it. We're not that good at measuring other things, and there are a lot of different things out there in terms of how you can measure social and environmental value. We actually work very closely with one of Yolanda's colleagues, Henrietta Moore, at the Institute for Global Prosperity, who's doing some amazing work on how you can actually find ways to measure long-term social and environmental value within communities. And so I steer listeners towards the work she and her team are doing at the Institute for Global Prosperity, and particularly in Camden at the moment. And so I don't think it's necessarily a counterpoint. If you're driving a car, you can look at your speed, you can look at which gear you're in, you can look at whether you've got enough fuel, you can look at multiple different monitors as to whether or not you're in a safe and good place to be driving your car. And it seems that when we think about financial metrics, we often look at it in a very binary way. So to use that analogy, we're trying to look at it more holistically rather than just how fast we're going, which is maybe the monetary element. In terms of land, because that's actually the piece that I was really excited to hear picked up on, and it's really the kind of underpinning of why we've kind of taken this approach in terms of Skyrim, because we looked at it from first principles, and the white paper that we actually published with Henrietta Moore and her team at the Institute for Global Prosperity, a fundamental piece of that is looking at starting with why is housing in London so expensive, and then relying on research, including that of Yolanda's and others, understanding that well over 50%, typically in London, around 70% of the cost of a home is not actually the architecture, the bricks and mortar, it's the land upon which that is built. And that will be blindingly obvious to 90% of people on the call. But if you understand that, when you take the approach that a lot of house builders take, or even local authorities take, the only way you can get to affordability is by using smaller and smaller space standards, lower quality materials, building higher and higher, and essentially compromising the actual living space. And we came up with the idea for Skyrim really from looking at this from first principles, saying, actually, is there a way that you can stay near the centre of the city, but reduce the cost of suitable urban building land by roughly 10 times? And that led us down the route of looking at what we do, which is airspace development in partnership with local authorities and housing associations. So how can you incrementally add density to areas, relying on lower land values because the land has actually already been built on, there's already a building there, and then add additional stories in the airspace above that. And so it's a very, in the same way that Steve referred to the meanwhile use that he's looking at across London as still a relatively niche solution. But if you have 5-10 niche solutions to this, they add up to actually a significant number of homes that can be delivered. And so, for example, if we look at what Skyrim are looking to do in terms of airspace development, some analysts think that there's as many as 630,000 new homes that could be delivered in the airspace across London. Maybe that's a top estimate. Other estimates we've seen look at around 180,000 new homes, but we're still talking in the hundreds of thousands of new homes that could be delivered through this route. And the critical piece here being that if you can do it at scale, you can really begin to bring down that cost to the end user. And the main thing is focusing on that big line in the unit economics, which is land value.
Fantastic, Arthur. Thanks very much indeed. Olivia, do you want to pick up on any of these threads? And they're multiple now, but particularly around this idea of how we value land in the equation, the viability equation, and also the role of public private partnerships generally. Our viewers strongly agree that public-private partnerships are essential to delivering the housing that we need. But how much do we need to tweak the missions and get the missions right in order to make those partnerships work properly?
So the first point on the value of land, it's a really interesting one. And I think probably housing associations and charities have been challenging themselves on this for some time, because our mission, we're slightly different from housing associations, but our mission is to deliver affordable housing. Mm-hmm. So you will compromise the value that you get out for providing more social impact.
Yeah, Ben Cocken, a viewer, has made this point. He's saying, he's asking how much housing associations use the capital value of your site to subsidise the affordable housing provision. So that capital value is really important. Yeah. Yeah,
and I suppose we as a charity we're not focused on delivering significant returns. We're only focused on delivering returns to enable us to continue operating. Right. So essentially, you invest some of your value back into your charitable, and Steve made a really good point about the housing associations that stay very true to their mission, which is often delivering that social housing. You wouldn't deliver social housing if you were trying to make money. It doesn't. A social house is, even without the land value, is probably worth less in terms of the rent you can charge than what you have to spend to build it. So there are organisations that are doing that already. And someone's also put a really interesting point on the Q&A about I think it's HM Treasury and why they hold the land. And so it's about how do we change the question asked, how do we change the culture rather than the rules about value? I have to say, I don't know the answer, but people should read that quote on the chat because it's really interesting. What was the second part of your question, Toby?
Really around the public-private partnerships and how important your sense of mission is in enabling you to undertake those and be successful in them, and whether we require missions in order to make those public-private partnerships work properly. A lot of talk around partnerships is around values, right? Shared values, and that's what the mission really illustrates. No.
Yeah, and I think setting out what those are really early on is really important, because I do think there's a distrust, that property developers have made huge amounts of money over, the boom period of the last few years, and possibly local authorities, and this is property companies developing their own land, and local authorities maybe haven't got the best deal out of the Section 106 or the planning agreements, and so there's that distrust that exists. I'm sit on the board of the Westminster Property Association. It's quite an interesting point. I'm the only charity, well, there's the Church Commissioners, but I'm the charity on the board, and we're trying to deliver affordable housing. And actually, I think there's been quite a significant mood swing in that organisation over the time that I've sat on the board, because a lot of the organisations are very focused on place and delivering for the long term. And this is the landed estates, for example, again in Westminster, and so the focus has become much more about delivering long-term value rather than just delivering shorter-term value, and that puts them in a better position to work with the public sector, because there's much more of an alignment of interests, because you are there for the long term. You're not just there for a short-term gain. But yeah, like I said, the successful joint venture that we carried out with Westminster City Council, it was really important to establish the mission and then the parameters that surrounded that mission to enable everybody to get what they needed and nobody to feel that distrust that someone else was getting something out of it that they shouldn't be, wouldn't make too much money out of it.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. Yolandi, I mean, what's the art of the possible here? How far are we likely to see the development community go in perhaps mirroring what the great estates do in terms of their stewardship of land over the long term?
I've been wavering about whether to introduce sort of a concept into this conversation, but I think in light of this question, it's essential that I do so. We've talked about how land values, that asset price, has exploded, and without going into too much detail, I think it's a result of yield shift, a downward yield shift, a reduction of interest rates from high double digits to low and stable interest rates. And if you want to see what the impact of that is, you can look at Japan. Japan's lived with this for 2 or 3 decades now. You actually have no asset price growth in a low interest rate, sort of stable interest rate environment. In fact, you in some cases have depreciation and increased sort of focus on obsolescence. So my belief is that we're just heading into that environment now, where this land asset price inflation is over. And if you want evidence of that in London, just look at the prime central London property market, which has actually been falling in value since September 2014. It's as it were fully adjusted to that low inflation, low interest rate environment. And I think there is a revolution coming in terms of the industry, and picking up on Stephen Hill's very good point about, the Treasury rules allow for consideration of value in a much broader sense than we actually consider. It's about industry convention that's sort of hampering us here. And I think the RICS Red Book sort of valuation methods are set, I believe, to change dramatically over the coming years, and probably COVID has accelerated this. And I come back to my point about the true value of land being its capability of delivering, its productivity, if you like, its capability of delivering life and enterprise and all the other glorious things that go on in our cities. I think it will be happening at a more local level, and so these sort of what we've in the past called intangible values of land will actually become tangible, because they will be reflected in absolutely basically the bid rent that people are prepared to pay in an area. Now, if we in turn regulate is too strong a word, but if we encourage the sort of co-ownership, co-use and occupation of land for everybody, then it really will genuinely be the value of communities that is then reflected in the value of land. And if this revolution happens, as I think it will, for kind of really big sort of global financial reasons, as well as sort of bottom-up community-led reasons, if you like, then we have no choice but to reconsider how we value, how we trade land, how we allocate land, how we manage land, and what we're managing that land for and stewarding it for. So I'm very glad that you raised the sort of London estates, because there's some really interesting models of how stewardship for the long term, even in perpetuity, leads to some very different results of mixing tenures, mixing uses, mixing people very much more, if you're looking for that longer term value. So I'm saying the world's changing. We will all be looking at the longer term sort of total value of place. And that is going to change land values, the way we formalize them, and the way actually the industry and the conventions of the industry work. So we've got to understand this conversation in the context of this immense change that I think is coming at us from all sorts of directions.
Thanks, Yolandi. So Steve, there's a revolution coming. Is that right? Do you buy that?
I suspect there is, but in a very British way. It won't be a big bang. It will be something that in a few years' time we'll look back and say, that's when it started to change. I'm an optimist. I think that some of the things we've talked about, there is beginning to be an acceptance and a will to do them in the wider community. What all of us who are involved in different ways have to do is make sure that we take people with us as we do that.
Fantastic. Arthur, does that resonate with you?
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, maybe short-term pragmatic and pessimistic, long-term incredibly optimistic in terms of the direction of travel, but it will be an uphill struggle. And I'm conscious in terms of we're kind of running slightly short on time. So in terms of how, from a Skyrim perspective, how we're really interested in working, I guess, taking action on some of the big ideas we've been discussing on this call, taking action on things like land value, public-private partnership, working with organisations such as Olivia's in terms of delivering homes for key workers. That's where we're trying to put our time and our money, is around that. And if anyone listening is or on the call is from either a housing association or a local authority, this Friday, applications close for the £100 million Key Worker Homes Fund. And that money is there to be able to help accelerate the delivery of affordable, beautiful, sustainable homes for key workers so they can live near to where they work. So I'm sure someone will put a link to it in the chat. But if anyone's interested in finding out more or applying, it'd be great to continue the conversation offline.
And we'll make sure to circulate that link to all viewers after the event as well. Thank you very much indeed, Arthur. And that is an appropriate last word. I always feel with the best of these discussions that we've started more conversations than we finished, as it were. And I'm sure we could talk about this for hours and hours and hours. There's so much, and we've got such great minds to inquire of as well. There's so much information stored in these people for us to dig into. It's a feast, an absolute feast. But it's time for lunch, viewers, or perhaps your daily exercise ration, or perhaps even a cheeky pint outdoors at your local, which is now open, but more likely just to jump on your next Zoom call. Before you do that, please could you join me in thanking our brilliant panel for sparing their valuable time to share their knowledge and experience and insights with us today. It's been a real treat. Thank you, Yolanda Barnes of the Bartlett Real Estate Institute, and thank you, Sir Steve Bullock from the Housing and Finance Institute, and thank you, Olivia Harris at Dolphin Living, and thank you, Arthur Kay of the Key Worker Homes Fund and Skyrim, both for your contribution to the conversation and for your sponsorship, which has made this event possible. And most of all, viewers, as ever, thank you for again tuning in and gracing us with your attention and fueling the conversation with your stimulating questions. I'm afraid loads of those are left hanging, but if you join our LinkedIn Members Club, you'll find responses from our panel circulated there over the coming days, and you'll get an early heads up on the compelling themes and topics we're going to be exploring next. The first thing on our agenda is the Naylor Review 3 years on, and how the Healthcare Estate Transformation Programme is being funded. We'll be looking at that with Morgan Sindel and a panel of experts on Tuesday at 11. Register for that and watch the video of this and all our other sessions at thevoiceofauthority.co.uk. So until Tuesday, from our fabulous panel, from Skyrim and the Key Worker Homes Fund, from me and from everyone at 3 Fox, good afternoon.